Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second day of What's New, What's Next. I'm Michelle Margolis Chesner, librarian for Jewish Studies at Columbia University and vice president of the Association for Jewish Libraries. Just a reminder to everyone that questions and comments about the session should be entered in the chat on the conference platform, and we look forward to hearing from you. In 2015, Columbia University received a grant from the United States National Endowment for the Humanities to digitize the field notes of hundreds of linguistic interviews documenting the broad variety of spoken Yiddish across Eastern and Western Europe to produce the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry, or LCAAJ. As part of the work on that project, Sandra Kiritescu, a graduate student in Columbia's Yiddish program, completely reprocessed the nearly 300 boxes of the archive of the LCAAJ. One of the many interesting items that Sandra encountered over the course of her work was a proposal for use of the brand new IBM computer at the Watson Scientific Computing Library at Columbia University. Uriel Weinreich, the project director, had been thinking about computer use for quite some time. In 1961, he wrote a brief document on machine aids in the compilation of linguistic atlases. By the fall of 1962, Weinreich was using the 7090 machine to process the data collected in the interviews. So Jewish Studies was indeed active during the very origins of what came to be known as digital humanities, or digital scholarship more broadly. I come to digital humanities not as a historian, but as a librarian and curator. When I think about Jewish studies in the digital world, I think about how much has already been lost because of its digital format. And I listen carefully to the words of digital conservators about best practices for maintaining data through changing technologies and formats. When we began digitizing images of the data for the LCAAJ, we were acutely aware that the data had already existed in a digital format, in cards that were now unreadable due to the unavailability of the machines that could interpret their punches. My colleague Bob Scott spent hundreds of hours doing a kind of reverse engineering to capture data that had been inputted in the 1960s, scanning computer printouts and cleaning up OCR in order to make the text searchable once again, nearly 60 years later. Even more recently, a review of online discussions from only a decade ago at the Center for Jewish History's excellent conference on Jewish Studies in the Digital World shows clearly just how much and how fast the field continues to shift. And if you're interested, there are still many tweets under the hashtag CJH-A2I from that conference. Librarians and museums have been at the forefront of this work for decades, serving as the first point of contact to get materials, data, and text into digital formats. Before the historian can address the questions of how one can do research with digital materials, a librarian deals with the costs and labor of digitization, not only putting images online, but also making sure that the information has the appropriate metadata to make it actually searchable, and more importantly, findable. Collaboration is key to so much of the work that forms the bedrock of the digital humanities. A discussion about high costs of digitized newspapers at the same conference a decade ago led to a collaboration between 3 New York libraries to make OCR'd text searchable newspapers in Yiddish, English, German, Ladino, and Hebrew from the American Jewish Press, freely available to the public in partnership with the Jewish Historical Press Project out of Tel Aviv University and the National Library of Israel. But digitization only scratches the surface of digital scholarship. We live in an age of algorithms searching for similarities in massive text corpora, dazzling visualizations and maps that show movement and impacts across the world, digital analyses of vast networks and data sets, and machines that can discern paleographical differences in ancient texts. It can be incredibly overwhelming. It seems like a new and exciting digital project is announced every third week. It takes an enormous amount of effort to assess, analyze, and compile it all in a usable fashion. It is thus my great pleasure to introduce Harben Zalsma, assistant professor at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History, C2DH, at the University of Luxembourg. Dr. Zalsma is spearheading the creation of a portal to the myriad digital projects relating to Jewish studies research in order to make them findable to potential collaborators, scholars, and funders, an incredible boon to all of those interested in the ever-expanding world of digital Jewish studies. As part of this work, he has studied the history of Jewish studies scholars' embrace of new technologies, both in their successes and in their failures. He has identified the researchers, librarians, and professors who have impacted the field and pushed it ever forward. Dr. Zaagsma's extensive work to further the cause of the digital work in Jewish studies makes him well placed to talk with us about the past and potential futures in this digital world. Harbin is actively involved in journals dealing with digital research, such as Studies in Digital History and Hermeneutics and Journal of Digital History, while at the same time serving on the advisory board of the well-known Jewish studies journal, Studia Rosenthaliana, on the Jews of the Netherlands. His own research focuses on Jews in the years prior to and during the Holocaust, but his work in the digital realm has extended far beyond that. Dr. Zaagsma worked tirelessly to bring together dozens of people working in what we now call the DH Jewish world to discuss their projects, spanning from biblical times to the present, at a conference this past January, and he is continuing that work in leading the editorial team on a book based on some of the presentations at that conference. I can personally attest to connections and ongoing working groups that resulted from this gathering, and I know that there are additional groups beyond those in my own field of Jewish book history that were spawned from that conference. We all have so much to gain from Dr. Zaagsma's work. I'm therefore delighted to turn over the virtual microphone so we can hear from Dr. Harbin Zaagsma on exploring Jewish history in the digital age. Dr. Zaagsma.
Thank you so much, Michelle Chesner, for that most kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to the conference organizers. I will start sharing my slides with you. It's very nice to be here today and be able to talk with you about exploring Jewish history in the digital age. Being a historian, of course, I have to start with a nice quote. As a sort of cliffhanger for my talk. So let me transport you back to the World Congress of Jewish Studies conference in Jerusalem in 1969, where a certain Henry Eckstein gave a paper about how to increase effectiveness of research in Jewish studies. And Eckstein prefaced his paper with the following words: "Many changes have taken place in the last 50 years in methodology of research in the field of Jewish studies, but the mechanical tools with which the researcher works have remained almost unchanged in the last 500 years." And basically, in his contribution to the conference, Eckstein outlined a vision for a database that, in his view, would solve many of the information challenges facing the field of Jewish studies. Eckstein argued that given the state of technology, it was now possible to, quote, establish a large-scale data bank which would include information in the field of Jewish studies and to connect this bank by means of a telecommunication network to the most important research centers in this field all over the world. Eckstein's vision here was actually reminiscent of early 20th century information organization systems, such as developed and realized by the Belgian lawyer and proto-information scientist Paul Otlet and his companion Henri Lafontaine. But it also echoes developments in data communications networks that got underway in the 1960s and would eventually evolve into the internet in the 1980s and the World Wide Web in the 1990s. Eckstein, in sum, was effectively outlining what an online library for Jewish studies could look like in an age when digital computing began to replace its analog siblings. But his remarks also raise a couple of broader questions. To begin with, they hint at the longue durée of the encounter between technology and the humanities, both in techno-material terms as well as in thinking through its broader consequences for humanities research practices. Secondly, they highlight challenges in the realm of information management that were by no means exclusive to the field of Jewish studies alone, and in fact had been discussed by early information scientists for some decades already. And finally, Eckstein's remarks notwithstanding, the mechanical tools that he spoke of had in fact undergone significant change since the late 19th century, and Jewish studies scholars had keenly taken advantage of the possibilities they afforded ever since then. Indeed, historians such as Samuel Oppenheim had been using the photostat since the 1920s to gather dispersed materials about their research topics. Social scientists had been using punched card technology to study Jewish demographic developments since the late 1930s. Microfilming Jewish archives got underway in the late 1940s, and linguists had been using the aforementioned punched card technology to create concordances, word indexes, and process linguistic data since the late 1950s. And Michelle has already shown you Uriel Weinreich's work on the Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. So Eckstein's comments, in a way, we feel a lack of historical awareness that could be encountered until quite recently in much digital humanities discourse as well, in which the focus is usually on the present and the future, but much less on the past and how the past has informed the present and might inform the future. So given the broader historical context that I've tried to sketch here, the bigger question I wish to address today is what the encounter between new technologies and Jewish studies looked like in roughly the past 100 years, specifically in Jewish history, what it looks like today in the age of digital humanities and digital history, and with that broader context in mind, reflect on where we might be headed. Before asking how knowledge production in Jewish studies, especially Jewish history, has been affected by the emergence of new technologies, it is necessary to briefly address two questions first. First of all, the question of why considering the genealogy of the digital turn in the humanities is so important. And secondly, and relatedly, the question of why humanists should reflect upon the role and impact of technology in and on their work. Both questions are of a fundamental nature in that they ask how research practices in the humanities have historically evolved and, as a consequence, shaped its methodological and epistemological foundations. So as to the genealogy of the digital turn in the humanities, the fact that knowledge production has always been affected by new and emerging technologies is often forgotten. If we look at what we now call digital history, however, key epistemological and methodological questions were already debated decades ago by earlier generations of computing historians, both analog and digital. And as these earlier discussions are often overlooked, it seems as if every new generation of historians rediscovers the promise of digital history with all its attending hopes and visions and ambitions for reinventing and reshaping historical research. There seems to be a lack then of transmission of accumulated knowledge from the past, yet many of the fundamental questions that underpin current digital practices in historical research have remained the same, even if many applications of computing by today's digital historians might seem, and indeed are, radically different. And that rhetoric of radical newness is not unique to digital history, but, as Nyan, Flynn, and Welsh have argued, a general feature of much discourse about digital humanities in the past 20 years. And they warn that without an understanding of the history of computing in the humanities, quote, we are condemned to repeat the revolutionary trope ad infinitum, unquote, and succumb to a superficial and evolutionary model of progress in which that complex history is effectively erased. So to ground our current digital practices and learn from past experiences and expertise, I would argue that we need to contextualize and qualify what is new and what is not. In other words, we need an answer to the question, what were and are the continuities and ruptures in the use and uptake of new technologies in historical research and in the debates that accompanied them. In that context, Malte Rebijn has argued that a key issue for digital history today is not about the transfer of, quote, new initially complementary methods, unquote, but revolves around their transformation so as to, quote, replace existing methods and establish new ways of thinking, unquote. This transition from transfer science, Transferwissenschaft, as Rebijn calls it, to Transformationswissenschaft, transformational science, however, seems doomed to fail without knowledge of the very debates that accompanied attempts to introduce new technologies in historical research and the concomitant development of new methods and practices. This brings us to the second question. Why would humanities scholars reflect upon the role and impact of technology in and on their work? The answer to that question on its most basic level is that technology shapes and has always shaped scholarly research in manifold, albeit rather uneven ways. Technology can enable new research avenues on the one hand, but in the process, it might also introduce new constraints. To give a simple example, the photostat and the microfilm enabled researchers to consult materials whose originals were stored far away. At the same time, the loss of color, smell, and the very different materiality of the photographic representation prevented them from seeing certain properties which only the original possessed. And that absence subsequently affected their interpretive, their hermeneutical work, and thus their research outcomes. So as might be clear, from that very simple example, technology has an impact that directly affects knowledge production and goes beyond important but perhaps intellectually less consequential matters of saving time and effort. Technology shapes, frames, and alters the various stages of the research process, and as important, can determine what can be researched and which questions can be asked and answered. Indeed, the very rationale of attending to technology's role lies in its potential to expand the possibilities and conditions for knowledge production. As the French historian Emmanuel Laurey-Ladurie already noted in 1973, and I quote, "In history, as elsewhere, what counts is not the machine, but the problem. The machine is only interesting insofar as it allows to tackle new questions that are original because of their methods, content, and especially scale." Unquote. Similarly, the well-known digital humanist avant la lettre, the priest and scholar Roberto Busa, remarked in 1980 that, quote, "the use of computers in the humanities has as its principal aim the enhancement of the quality, depth, and extension of research, and not merely the lessening of human effort and time," unquote. And more recently, Willard McCarthy, a very well-known digital humanist who founded the Digital Humanities Mailing List Humanist, one of the oldest academic mailing lists on the internet. McCartney, by the way, was once also affectionately described as the Obi-Wan Kenobi of digital humanities. And McCartney has advocated for understanding the computer as a machine to think with, borrowing a phrase of literary critic Ivor Richards, who used it to describe the Codex book already in 1925. And in this understanding, the machine changes our thinking, it widens our cognitive horizons, and our skillful use is what activates that potential, which is only limited by our imagination, a faculty that incidentally is much admired by most humanists, even those of the machine-fearing kind. Information scientists, however, have been much more aware of technology's impact and how it transcends technical modalities than many humanists. Michael Buckland, for instance, has talked about the material and social aspects of becoming informed. In that view, technology is transformational by nature. Media are socially embedded and constituted, and information shapes and is shaped by the social constellations in which it moves. And all of this shapes knowledge production. As the literary scholar Jerome McGann said when discussing the digital archive, quote, "digitizing the archive is not about replacing it. It's about making it usable for the present and the future. To do that, we have to understand as best we can how it functioned, how it made meanings in the past," unquote. Understanding how today's digital archive make and enable meanings is, of course, an essential task for any contemporary historian. So with this in mind, let's have a look at the emergence and the uptake of new technologies in Jewish studies. And to do so, we should go back to the early 20th century when photography began to be used for educational, reproduction, and research purposes. And archives began to offer photographic services on their premises, and photocopy rooms. By that, until World War II, those techniques, those mechanical aids, mostly concerned technologies of reproduction. But a key technology that is often overlooked in this context, basically between photography and the later microfilm in the 1930s, was the photostat, which was invented in the early 1900s and by the 1920s had made already quite an impact on scholarly work, including among Jewish historians. Indeed, in 1927, American Jewish Historical Society President Abraham Rosenbach noted the following in his address for the Society's 35th annual meeting, quote, "By means of the photostat, records are much more easily and quickly copied than in the laborious way of the old historians so that results can be obtained in half the time. I have to say, I love that quote. The laborious way of the old historians. This is a century ago. And as an example, Rosenbach mentioned historian Samuel Oppenheim, whose work focused on Jews in the Americas, the British and Dutch colonies included. And Oppenheim was a prolific collector of materials and managed to obtain many important documents from archives in the Netherlands, including from the Sephardi Jewish, the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam, but also the National Archives. And for that, the photostat was an indispensable tool. And importantly, the impact of that use of the photostat went beyond saving time. It actually enabled Oppenheim to expand the horizons of his research and study what previously could not be studied, or only with great difficulty and investment of resources, because Oppenheim was, of course, in America, and his archives were all over the place. Upon his death in 1928, Oppenheim's personal archive was obtained by the Society and would form the basis for other historians' research. For example, Herbert Bloom's study of Brazilian Jewish history, published in 1934. And in that same decade, microfilm would also become an important means of preservation and reproduction in especially American libraries and archives. And here too, the Jewish documentary record was part of the effort. Within the context of the Historical Records Survey, for instance, that took place between 1935 and 1942, Jewish congregational records were microfilmed, and other types of documentation would follow suit, especially after the Second World War. Meanwhile, punched card systems for data processing made their entry in academic research in the 1930s, and not only in the sciences, but also anthropology, literature, the social sciences, and especially economic history. In the 1940s, geographers and demographers began to use the technology in the realm of Jewish population studies. And then in the late 1940s and early 1950s, work began on automated machine translation, concordances, and word index, and its impact in Jewish studies would soon be felt. On 26 March 1958, the priest and scholar Roberto Busa and IBM engineer Paul Tasman held a press conference at IBM headquarters in New York to describe their literary data processing work on the Dead Sea Scrolls using punched card technology. And their presentation made headlines all over the world. You can see here a couple of newspaper articles from the Dutch press. For those who read Dutch, there's also a little bit of wordplay going on here in the titles. And this was something that was picked up in several contexts. It was a presentation, as I said, that made headlines all over the world, and Busa subsequently also presented the research in July 1961 at the Third World Congress of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. But actually the work was an offshoot of Busa's main work on the Index Thomisticus, which he had begun in 1949 with the help of IBM, and which would eventually earn him the reputation of founding father of the digital humanities. For those interested in more of that history, I would point you to Stephen Jones' wonderful book about Roberto Busa called The Priest and the Punched Cards, in which he also devotes a chapter to that work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and at the same time sort of deconstructs that myth of Busa being the founding father of the digital humanities, and really tries to sort of historicize and complicate that with history, as Jones writes very, very nicely. And then we get to the project that Michel talked about. Around the same time, in the early 1960s, great strides were made in the realm of Yiddish studies and Yiddish linguistics to expand the use of punched cards to enable the processing of linguistic data. In 1961, Uriel Weinreich managed to acquire funding to use Machine Age to create a language and culture atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry. And as Weinreich would note, quote, when one tries to visualize the editing of an atlas of many hundreds of maps with up to 500 locations on each, it becomes clear what advantages are gained by the electronic filing and sorting of the data, unquote. And you see here actually some of that archival material that Michel also talked about in an article that Weinreich wrote about the work that they did within the context of that project. And then a few years later, another very important project launched in 1967, the Responsa project, a computerized full text retrieval system providing access to, as Jacob Trueca described it, rabbinical case law documents spanning more than 10 centuries. So, as will be clear from that very, very sketchy overview, when Eckstein told his audience in 1969 at the World Congress of Jewish Studies that the mechanical tools with which the researcher works have remained almost unchanged in the last 500 years, it was perhaps missing some quite important developments. In fact, at that point in time, in the late 1960s, humanities computing had firmly taken hold in the academy. Conferences had already been organized, global conferences in the 1960s. Many events and workshops were organized. Newsletters and journals had been started. So there was a lot going on, not only in the academy, incidentally, but also in the heritage sectors. Museums were exploring how computers could be used as aids in their work. Archives were exploring how they could use computers in their work and how they could support researchers. So the late 1960s, early 1970s was a moment when a lot of different things were actually going on in that realm. And those developments would all continue as the era of mainframe computing began to give way to micro and personal computers, which were introduced at universities from the late 1970s onwards, and the internet and the World Wide Web arrived on the scene in the early 1990s. And during all that time, librarians and archivists eagerly discussed the possible applications of new technologies, including, for instance, on the pages of the American journal Judaica Librarianship. And more than discussing, they actually also actively sought to shape the future form of the Jewish documentary record. And thus, in October 1991, at a time when the personal computer had become a common tool for scholars and the internet had just arrived at universities, the Leo Baeck Institute organized a conference on problems and issues in Jewish archives and historiography in the 5 new states of Germany. And that meeting resulted in a plan to create a database of Jewish archival holdings in the states of the former German Democratic Republic with the aim of enhancing access to these dispersed collections. And in an echo of Eckstein's earlier vision, Robert Jacobs noted about the project, and I quote, "How very fortunate we are to live in a time when electronic capabilities enable us to provide bibliographic references that will allow subsequent generations of scholars to find the materials they seek with no more than a few keystrokes," unquote. So this plan was a great example of the application of new technologies to further Jewish historical research at this turning point in time, when the internet arrived at the scene. Importantly, it was also a project where the proposal was made to build an online catalog. This was not a digitization project, and that's a point to which I will come back later, because that actually has a bearing upon the broader picture that I will try to paint in the remainder of the talk. At the same time, also, the publication of primary sources in the form of CD-ROMs and online databases and textual editions led to a great sea change during the 1990s, enabling far easier access to materials and fundamentally changing scholarly information management practices. The impact of these developments on the field of Jewish studies were a major focus of Heidi Lerner's Perspective on Technology column in the Association of Jewish Studies Perspectives magazine, published on a regular basis between 2003 and 2011. And Lerner's 2002 article, New Technologies and Old Methodologies, Jewish Studies Research in the Digital Age, was probably one of the first to comprehensively address the possibilities that the digital turn offered for Jewish studies scholars. And again, then as now, librarians and archivists were at the forefront of digital developments and pointed the way for humanities scholars. And what you see here on the slide is an early version of the Responsa project, drawn from the Internet Archive. I think the capture is from 2006, but the project went online in the 1990s already. Kudos to the marketing person who came up with the tagline, "The wisdom of the ages, the technology of the 21st century." Although, as we can see by the little note about the missing plugin, the technology of the 21st century might have a tendency to become obsolete quite quickly as well. In fact, quite a lot faster than, for instance, microfilms. And for anyone who has ever worked with CD-ROMs, probably a lot of those CD-ROMs that were created in the 1990s are not playable anymore on modern computers. I myself was the editor of a CD-ROM in 1998, and I need an emulator to play that on my computer. That's actually a completely different discussion about the technologies and technology becoming obsolete, and something that especially digitization specialists spent a lot of time thinking about and dealing with. So yeah, let's return to the topic at hand. The early 2000s was also the period of the transition from humanities computing to what we now call digital humanities, characterized by mass digitization, big data, and a proliferation of new tools and new forms of knowledge dissemination. And to take stock of these developments in the field of Jewish history, the Center for Jewish History in New York ran a workshop in 2011 titled From Access to Integration, Digital Technologies and the Study of Jewish History, which sought to, quote, explore in a systematic way new approaches to coordinating and integrating the digitization of historical sources around the world. And that workshop also aimed to connect Jewish studies, information specialists, and academics to address all those challenges that emerging technologies pose for the study of Jewish history. In his keynote lecture during the workshop, entitled Digitization and Its Discontents for Jewish History, historian Anthony Grafton outlined the various ways in which the digital turn was affecting academia and academic libraries, including the possibilities of digitally reuniting dispersed material. He also noted that much of Jewish scholarship happens outside academic circles, meaning that open access to online Jewish resources had become highly important. Unfortunately, the various blog posts devoted to the conference do not reveal what answers were formulated as to the new approaches and challenges mentioned above, or indeed provide much detail as to what these are in the first place. But we find some resonance if you dig very well on Twitter. And there some people noted that it was the international scope and the long history and the multilingualism that were distinctive features of Jewish studies that should be tackled somehow by digital means. And then to give just a couple of examples of events that have been organized since then, to discuss this intersection of Jewish studies and digital humanities, we have, for instance, in 2013 and in 2017, workshops organized by the Institute for the History of the German Jews in Hamburg. One workshop, Jüdische Geschichte Digital, Jewish History in a Digital Key, with the aim to take stock of digital projects pertaining to German Jewish history. That event actually led to the creation of a network within the Digital History Working Group of the German Historical Association, which still exists. Meanwhile, of course, the AGS conferences and the European Association of Jewish Studies conferences feature panels and workshops on Jewish studies and digital humanities as well. And the European Association a couple of years ago also established a digital forum to engage with the digital scholarship more comprehensively. And one other event to note is maybe the last European Association of Jewish Studies conference in Krakow in 2018, which featured 2 digital humanities panels, including one on writing Jewish history in a digital key, which focused on big data and basically tried to, quote, address the question whether DH corpora and methods will enable us to find a new common ground in the field of Jewish history. Basically, the idea was to sort of ask if the fragmentation of Jewish history, as the authors of the panel saw it, could be sort of reconsidered and turned into an exploration of its longue durée by digital methods and by digital tools and data. And finally, as Michel already mentioned, in January of this year, we held the international conference online, just as this conference, DH Jewish Studies in the Digital Age, where more than 60 academics and heritage experts came together to discuss all kinds of different aspects relating to how the digital turn has affected Jewish studies. And that conference is actually part of a bigger project, which is also going to result in an online portal. Michelle also mentioned it. And here you see a screenshot of that, the future website that will be launched in December of this year. Pardon the small promotional intermezzo now. But we're basically creating a project or a directory of projects that deal with that intersection of Jewish studies and digital humanities. We have around 150 projects in there now. We have a news and events section, an online community, and we're building a Zotero bibliography. And it should be said in this context that this very much builds upon the foundational work that Michelle Chesner actually did. She started in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, a sort of inventory of the Age Jewish project. And that inventory was actually the basis for this project. So basically, to sum that up, in recent years, there have been a lot of efforts to understand and discuss how the digital turn has affected Jewish studies. At the same time, the number of projects has also exploded. And given that both Jewish studies and digital humanities are very broad umbrella terms that cover a wide array of topics and approaches, it's almost impossible at this point to start charging the intersections and to give a sort of comprehensive overview of all these projects. So let me turn now to my own field, Jewish history, and ask how the digital turn has had an impact there. Now, as we have already seen, as I've already hinted at, Jewish history has characteristics that produce specific challenges in the realm of information management. Think of its textual tradition, its diasporic nature, the migration, in many cases forced, of people, of text, of ideas, and thus its transnational aspects. And these characteristics are in turn reflected in both the state of Jewish heritage, think of dispersal of sources and objects, and its nature. It's multilingual, it's multiscriptural, and it's often, again, textual. And as a result, a key technological challenge for Jewish history in the digital age, and probably Jewish studies more generally, is to work towards solutions for information retrieval and analysis from dispersed, multilingual, and multiscriptural sources. Much work in that direction has actually been done in the past decades, and it has allowed us to engage the transnational, the interactional, the inter, intra, and cross-cultural dimensions of Jewish history in new ways. 15 years ago, Paula Hyman argued for the importance of comparative approaches to integrate what she called minority history into the history of majority populations. And around the same time, Moshe Rosman sought to probe the challenges that postmodernism posed for engaging with Jewish history or Jewish histories, including questions of Jewish identity, periodization, and intercultural relations. For their part, Irene Zwiep and Bart Ballard have more recently suggested that big data might be one answer to some of these questions, as its longitudinal character can help us to explore the longer durée of Jewish history. If indeed some of the key tenets of Jewish historiography nowadays lie in studying inter- and intra-Jewish as well as Jewish non-Jewish interactions, and in probing their fluid, constantly changing and evolving nature in space as well as in and over time, then digitization and digital history are well placed to address the challenges involved. Online resources make comparisons within and between Jewish populations, as well as between Jewish and non-Jewish populations, easier than ever. They can help answer the crucial question of what was specific for which Jewish experiences and for whose Jewish experiences. Computational techniques allow us to trace long-term trends in, for instance, newspapers, and thus shifting discourses and concerns. Network analysis can help to chart the global migration of books and intellectual ideas and explore Jewish interconnectedness across borders. Migration and migrant experiences can be traced, explored, and compared through newspapers and other sources. Both the multiplicity and the variety of Jewish histories and experiences, and that what united and unified them are thus opened up for new and renewed explorations. Now, it would be impossible to give anything near a complete overview of the array of projects dedicated to Jewish history that have appeared online in the past 3 decades. but some very broad strokes can be painted, can be outlined. East European Jewish history and migration, as well as the Holocaust, by their nature transnational themes, of course, rank prominently next to a huge variety of national and local history projects, which often also exhibit transnational dimensions. Looking at the kind of materials put online, newspapers, books, and manuscripts dominate. And in terms of language, Yiddish has slowly but very surely acquired its place next to many projects offering Hebrew materials, and of course, many, many artifacts in local languages. In the realm of East European Jewish history and migration, we find, of course, several YIVO projects, such as the somewhat older Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe and the soon-to-be completed Vilna collections project that you see here on the slide. In addition, we have projects such as Memoria Viva and the Jewish Diaspora Collection, part of the University of Florida's digital collections, which focus on Latin America, including the Caribbean. Then we have national, regional, and local history projects, so many that it's almost impossible to list. But some examples with clear transnational dimensions include, and those are just some examples, the South African Jewish Museum's Digital Archive or the South Africa Jewish Roots Bank, Yiddish Melbourne, and the Digibac project that features a lot of material that relates to Jewish exile and German Jewish history. And more nationally focused projects include, for instance, the Key Documents of German Jewish History, which is a well-known project in Europe and in Germany, but for instance also the Digital Library of the Italian Foundation Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation. Again, those are just a couple of important projects, but especially on a national level, there are many, many, many more. Newspapers constitute, of course, a very important type of sources, as they do in digital humanities in general. And a key resource here is, of course, the National Library of Israel's historical Jewish press website, which at the time of writing contains over 600 newspapers in 20 languages from all over the world. Though it has a clear focus on the regions East Europe, the Middle East, and North America, on the Jewish languages Yiddish and Hebrew, and the non-Jewish languages Arabic, Polish, French, and English. But of course, other databases complement these holdings, and a notable resource to mention there is Compact Memory, a database of German Jewish periodicals, which started as a standalone project, but is now incorporated into the digital offerings of the University of Frankfurt's library. And Compact Memory contains now more than 400 periodicals and newspapers in 9 languages, the bulk of which are in German. Now, as you can see on this slide, this is a small example of a search for the word Dreyfus in the historical Jewish web, in the historical Jewish press website. The fantastic possibilities that this offers is that you immediately get search results in a multitude of languages. You can just see below on the slide Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. There are many more in French, in German, in Spanish, and other languages. So this kind of database as a historian basically allows you, with the stroke of a key, to start finding materials that would allow you to do a comparative analysis, in this case of the resonance and fallout of the Dreyfus affair in the Jewish press at the time. But you can think, of course, of many, many more different projects, crucially important for historians, this kind of work. And then we have, of course, the probably the single most important topic, that you find the Holocaust, covered by a wide range of resources that includes the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, ERI, that you see on the slide here, the Arolsen Archives, the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive Online, the German Memorial Book Project, the Czech Holocaust Victims and Document Database, and in New York Public Library's Yizkor Book Collection. And as so many Holocaust-related sources and testimonies have become available online in recent years, scholarly attention has also very clearly shifted towards studying the nature of Holocaust memory in the digital age, with very, very important work coming out there. Now, while increased access to sources is obviously very beneficial and important to all historians, it's the increased access to their computable data that can help them even further to ask and answer new questions or revisit old ones. Think, for instance, of topic modeling techniques that can help identify key concerns in sets of Jewish newspapers over time. Or think about artificial intelligence techniques such as deep learning to classify and to revisit periodizations in source materials. Or think about new approaches to annotate text and images in historical writing, which allows scholars to query such materials in completely new ways. And there's a lot going on in those realms at the moment as well. But let me turn to another dimension of this story, and that is actually that relates to what I would call the politics of digitization and the question, what is actually being digitized? That's an important question that is in recent years is more and more debated in digital humanities. Digitization, of course, opens up new avenues for research, and it can help overcome the classic problem of dispersal of sources. But the crucial question to ask then is what Jewish heritage is actually available online and which stories about the past, in this case the Jewish past, can or cannot be told using them. And we know, of course, that archives and libraries are repositories of carefully selected and curated collections. They are not neutral. Elizabeth Yale noted a couple of years ago very aptly that no archive is innocent. And by the same token, the digitization of historical sources is far from neutral. Allusions to the infinite archive or the age of abundance notwithstanding, a large majority of archival material is not digitized, nor is there any institutional intention to do so in the foreseeable future. Archives, libraries, museums, and other heritage institutions and organizations select materials to be digitized based on a variety of criteria. These include the preservation of fragile materials, easy access to collection highlights and or often used materials, the research value of certain collections and academic research agendas, memory politics, discourses on the past, public discourses on the past, and the articulation of a country's imagined national identity are of similar importance, while legal, ethical, and copyright issues frame and possibly constrain digitization strategies and policies. And given the costs involved, the availability of funding, public or private, plays, of course, a key role in enabling digitization projects in the first place. And what you actually see on this slide is a small table from one of the Enumerate reports that chart the state of digitization in Europe. This is from 2017. And you can see here archives and other heritage institutions were basically asked, what have you digitally reproduced? What are you planning to digitally reproduce? And what do you not plan to digitally reproduce? And you can see in the case of archives, that is actually a lot. And in the case of some of these other institutions also. So there's a lot of our cultural heritage, which is not in the foreseeable future going to be digitized. Now, as digitization entails a selection of already selected analog materials, historians find themselves facing old questions pertaining to new and unfamiliar digital environments. How do digital resources shape the historical themes, topics, and debates that can be researched, and how might they influence research agendas more broadly? In what ways do they enable us to address new research questions and venture into new research avenues that challenge existing master narratives? Can they facilitate research into transnational histories when a lot of digitization projects and digitalization policies are in one way or another often nationally framed? In sum, what are the histories that we can and cannot tell with digitized cultural heritage, and how can we as historians best navigate the challenges that are involved in using them? Now, to be sure, the basic question of why, where, and how we can access what we can access and what histories can and cannot be written with them has, of course, not changed after the digital turn. These are old questions for historians. Yet, as historians increasingly make use of digital resources in their research, they have become much more urgent. So then the question is what the politics of digitization in the context of Jewish history looks like, and how we can ensure that the offline Jewish historical record remains as relevant as its online counterpart. And I very briefly want to return to the example of digitized newspapers that I gave. Looking at those newspaper databases, it's clear that certain parts of Europe, also Africa, Latin America, most of Asia are only covered to a limited extent. Now, to be sure, the number of newspapers that potentially could be digitized and is relevant is, of course, linked to the size of local Jewish populations. But the main point there should be clear: what is digitized shapes, of course, the stories that we can tell. At the same time, those situations can be very fluid. If you look at the history of the digitization of Yiddish newspapers and archives, this is actually quite illustrative of the fluid and ever-evolving nature of the issue. A decade ago, few Yiddish newspapers were available online, whereas today the numbers run in the hundreds. Meanwhile, the YIVO Vilna Online Collections project, which reunites, by the way, the YIVO Institute's pre-war library and archival collections in both New York and Vilnius, is nearing completion. Combine this with the Yiddish Book Center's digital Yiddish library, which can now be full text search, a big game changer. And also combine it with the recent union list of Yiddish publications in the collections of the YIVO, the Yiddish Book Center, the New York Public Library, and the National Library of Israel. And we face today a very different situation. Indeed, we face a situation where we really have an abundance and a great variety of available Yiddish heritage online. And importantly, much of that work was and is funded by private donors and individuals. So basically, it's the community itself that takes responsibility for digitizing its own transnational heritage. Okay. In the written version of this paper, I actually included some parts about how digitization has affected my own research. I'm going to leave them out for time's sake because we're nearing 5 o'clock. We might talk a little bit about that during the discussion. So I basically want to finish with an outlook. But before doing that, perhaps I should explain to you this table that you're looking at. Coming back to the politics of digitization, the question is, of course, what are then actually these political dimensions if we talk about digitization at this moment? And 20 years ago, a little bit more than 20 years ago, Richard Brown and Beth Davis Brown wrote a seminal article called The Making of Memory. And in that article, they outlined a number of political dimensions of archival and curatorial work. You see them here on the slide on the left, and what I did on the right is transpose those political dimensions that they outlined to the digital realm as a means to think further through what is actually going on and what are the questions that we could be asking when we discuss digital resources. So, for example, the Browns talk about the allocation of collections to different libraries and archives. In the digital realm, the question there is which institutions are actually digitizing and which institutions control digital collections. The Browns talk about collection developments, decisions about what is actually collected and what not, and what is merely stored but not cataloged, so what is made intellectually accessible. In the digital realm, the question there is what is digitized and why is it digitized? And also what is being metadated and not. Then we have cataloging and classification, so the organizational and the intellectual description of what is held, as the Browns described it, which schema are being used to classify materials. In the digital realm, the question there is also how are things classified and how are they metadated, which schemes are being used for that. And finally, we have the question of circulation and access. So decision about who can actually access archives and libraries. As they point out, that is also shaped partly by the classification scheme that is being used. And in the digital realm, the question then becomes how is access actually provided and how is it mediated? Is it sitting behind a paywall or is it openly available on the internet? Is it, for instance, only available in in libraries and archives, meaning you need to have a subscription to access certain digital materials. These are all important questions, and how it is mediated is, of course, in that sense, very important. So these are some of the bigger questions that are very useful to get a handle on critically looking at digital sources in general. But let me finish with an outlook on this story about Jewish studies and Jewish history and digital humanities. So what I've tried to do here is to provide a historical context to the digital turn in Jewish studies and especially Jewish history, and ask how technology has affected its study in the past and present. Of course, it's been a very sort of broad strokes, a sketchy outline. But the question then is, what could the future hold for research into Jewish history? And there are at least 3 challenges that came to my mind, summarized in the heading of this slide: educate, disclose, and link. The first challenge relates to education and the public at large. I've confined myself mostly in this lecture to the academic study of Jewish history, but of course all the resources that I've mentioned are used by and aimed at broader audiences. And an especially important question to ask here is how digital resources can be used for educational purposes. And I think that question is really important because we live at a moment where we see a rapid spread and an increasing normalization of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on social media, especially in the wake of the current COVID pandemic. Something that at this moment is actually a very, very pertinent question in the Netherlands, with even politicians in parliament retweeting COVID skeptic material from fiercely anti-Semitic accounts, thereby slowly normalizing things. So this is a question where all historians of Jewish history, whether they work in public history or not, have a role to play. The second challenge relates to digital resources themselves and the crucial importance of increasing access to the information contained within them. 3 years ago, the books in the Digital Yiddish Library were not text searchable, but today they are text searchable. And developments in handwritten text recognition will soon enable similar access to archival materials. Imagine a situation where the handwriting and also images and photos in the YIVO Vilna online collections, for instance, can be searched in addition to printed text. Developments in handwritten text recognition, developments in computer vision for photos and images are going to become really, really important in the coming years. And the third and final challenge lies in the realm of interlinking and integrating resources. That's a challenge that has been picked up in Jewish studies in a number of projects. For instance, the International Collection of Digitized Hebrew Manuscripts, KETIV. We also have more recently the Judaica Link project in Germany, which seeks to interlink structural information from all kinds of existing reference works of Jewish history and culture. Very importantly, we have projects like the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, but also the Yerusha database that you see here on the slide, that provide access to archival descriptions and metadata from many, many archives. And this also highlights the crucial importance, I've already mentioned this, of cataloging, which is often forgotten. But if we recognize that many archives will never be digitized, then there is a clear challenge, namely that online cataloging and linking of archival descriptions is as important as digitization. And that's why projects like ERI and Yerusha are so crucially important. So basically addressing these challenges, I think, will go a long way to bring about the potential of the digital turn for research into Jewish history and more broadly a fuller understanding of its manifold and multifaceted trajectories. And that's where I'm going to leave it for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Arben, for a really wonderful and illuminating talk. We already have some questions, so I'm going to go right to them. Anthony Polonsky starts with asking if you could say something about the implications of the digitalization of books and journals for the viability of publishers.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. That's of course a very, very important one. And then it's a general question that affects a lot of work in the humanities. Books and journals don't pay for themselves. They need to be paid for. And we currently have, of course, a move towards open access. That move is also politically pushed. For example, in the EU, funding is more and more tied to open access to the research results. Of the projects that are being funded with public money, with taxpayer money, that is a good thing. But at the same time, it means that you need to think about how books and journals indeed are going to be published. There are different models for that. I think actually, Michelle, you are probably better placed to discuss that as a librarian than I am as a historian. But to give you one example, we have a new book series at the center where I work in digital history, and we collaborate with the Greuter publishers, and we pay a certain amount of money for every volume to have it immediately published in open access, and that means that we need to acquire the funding to publish those books in that way, project funding or other resources. With a lot of journals, you see, of course, different varieties of open access and payment models, sometimes author payment fees that are attached to that. I know in the Netherlands, when I worked at the Huygens Institute for the History of Netherlands, there was an experiment by the Dutch Academy of Sciences to fund for a number of years a pilot project whereby the main Dutch history journal would move towards open access and fund that transition. It's a difficult question. I think a lot of publishers are now moving to new models where that can become sustainable. But that is sort of all that I can say about it as a historian. I really lack the knowledge, the detailed knowledge, to answer how publishers are handling those questions at the moment. But perhaps, Michelle, if you want to add to that.
I'll just say a few words from my position as a librarian. The costs of journals have risen exponentially in the last couple of decade or so. And so libraries that used to just buy everything are no longer able to do that. And so there has been a lot of effort to collaborate on purchasing in various ways. But one of the things I think both you and I mentioned is the Jewish Historical Press Project. And Columbia University, my institution, is a partner on a project with New York University and the New York Public Library, where we are actually putting collections money, so money that we otherwise would have used to buy books and databases, toward digitization of certain newspapers, in this case for the American Jewish Press portion of the Jewish Historical Press. And the reason that we did that is because their subscription databases for these same journals end up costing exponentially more than the cost of us paying for the digitization and the quality control and the metadata and the good work that's being done at the National Library of Israel and Tel Aviv University. So we're in libraries, we're thinking about a lot of different kinds of models of where the funds will come from to make these materials accessible in different ways. So the open access movement, of course, is very exciting from somebody who's actually has to pay for those journals. But also finding the funds is complicated. And there are a number of grants that are there. Sometimes internally an institution will support a professor who wants to, or a researcher who wants to publish something in an open access journal. There's funding that they can get internally to support those costs, because open access journals are not free by any means. That's definitely something that needs to be made very clear. And the money has to come from somewhere, just like with paid journals. So yep. I think that's a really important question. And thank you for bringing that up.
There is, especially in Europe, again, there have been several universities and also national university library associations that have made decisions not to continue subscriptions to, for instance, commercial publishers like Elsevier, who have 30-40% profit margins, whereas most of the work in terms of course, writing the research and the peer reviewing is actually unpaid labor by academics. And it seems that that move, especially if that happens on a national level, does force publishers also to think about other ways to publish research, especially to push down those profit margins, because I think there's really a problem there. On the other hand, there are of course also many scholarly journals who are not published by commercial publishers, and where the work somehow needs to be paid for as well. So it's not as simple as saying like we shouldn't be paying for this, because the money needs to be coming from somewhere.
There is actual labor that's going into.
If only to have the platform where you publish the research online, the infrastructure behind it, the technical maintenance, etc., etc. And then we're not even talking about marketing and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcin Wodzinski raises the question, Dear Gerben, many thanks for your most interesting presentation. In your speech, you focused on digitization and source availability. Could you please elaborate on a bit on other aspects of digital humanities, especially new tools and their importance specifically for Jewish studies? Also, what about projects aiming at building data sets, which is not the same as digitizing sources, and creating new tools specific to them? And that's something, as you know, is very dear to my heart, because that's a project I'm working on as well, is collecting new data and making it available.
Yeah. Could you post a question in the chat as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was showing up on the screen, so we're gonna.
I a very quick response, because I see that I've started a conference platform now, and I see that Anthony Polonsky is also responding. Yes, I totally agree that there is an issue with editorial control and policies in some cases of online publishing, and that is definitely something to be aware of and work on. Let me very quickly. New tools. Yeah, I've alluded to that a little bit, but I think very, very important. And I think one crucially important development is what I mentioned, is handwritten text recognition, which in general has the potential to completely transform how people work with online archives. The issue there is really how do you disclose the information contained within archives? OCR is of course very nice if it works well, but archives usually have many more materials where you are not dealing with printed text, but you're dealing with handwriting, and there are really in the last years huge developments in facilitating that, as well as developments in computer vision to actually enable image recognition, and then being able to search for images and doing research with that as well. There's even now a field called, in the past 2 or 3 years, called computational archival science, where a lot of those bigger technical challenges as they relate to the digital archive are actually where computer scientists are collaborating with archival scientists and archivists to solve some of those challenges. Those challenges, by the way, also lie in the realm of reclassifying materials in digital archives, so that you're not so dependent on human-created metadata classifications and schema, etc., etc. So that's about the new tools. What I can add there. Projects aiming at building data sets and creating new tools specific to them. Yeah, very important as well. I think there's a bit of a move in some digital humanities projects to not only offer the materials, but also some tools to analyze them. There is perhaps a bit of a difference between more public-facing digital resources and more academic-facing public resources, where that question of how do you access the data behind the images, so to speak, and then the tools to
open data.
Yeah, to open data is very important. In digital humanities, until now, the model is usually that you want to have a way to access the data, export it, and then run your own analysis on them, whether that's topic modeling, all kinds of text mining, mapping, a lot of things that you can think of. it relates a little bit to a question I see now in the chat by Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett. Thank you very much for that. So the role of digital tools in working with digitized materials, it depends a little bit, I think, on the research questions and the materials at hand. So for a lot of people, simply having access to the materials is already enough, especially if you work with smaller sets of sources. And I know a lot of scholars who work with digitized materials in that sense. They simply take what they can find online and they use that in their research. The question there is, of course, like what kinds of digital source criticism, etc., do you apply to that if you work with that? That in turn actually relates to something that I haven't mentioned in the lecture, but I should perhaps mention at this point. These meta questions that I try to ask about the politics of digitization falls into a broader context of what you could call a critical turn in digital humanities in the last couple of years. So basically, we've moved from a situation where, let's say, 10 years ago, there was a sort of technological determinism, a focus very much on the tools and the data themselves. But in the last couple of years, a lot of scholars have studied things like data criticism. How are our data sets constituted, and what does that do to research? Tool criticism. So how do the tools that we use actually affect the research that we do and can do? Algorithmic criticism. How do the algorithms that we use, for instance, in topic modeling, but also behind search engines, influence the search results or the research results that we get, and how does that shape our research? Interface criticism. How do interfaces actually guide us to certain results or influence how we perceive the results and what we can find? There has been work going on now in co-designing interfaces of digital research resources together with historians and with other researchers to sort of more closely align those different interests with one another, and to show, for instance, how digital resources, how digitized materials are composed, what you can find in a digital resource. Also to address a crucial issue, for instance, for historians, how you deal with context and awareness of context when you're working with digital resources, which is a key issue, for instance, if you work with digitized newspapers. Everyone who has ever done newspaper research the old-fashioned way knows how that works. You leaf through the paper, or you leaf through the microfilm, so to speak. But by doing that, you get an awareness of the bigger context, the general coverage of a newspaper while you're looking at a more specific topic. But if you work with digitized newspaper databases, you're immediately transported to the micro level, and you actually need to zoom out to get that broader context that, as a historian, you should be interested in. And that is a really big issue. How do you prevent a sort of decontextualized type of research, and how can technology help to prevent that? Again, interfaces there are quite important. But to come back a little bit more directly to Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett's question, the role of digital tools in working with digitized materials. Again, that depends on the research question, but in recent years there's been a lot of work, for instance, going on in topic modeling discourses in for instance, digital newspapers, and trying to figure out what are actually the main topics and how do they shift over time, and how do certain topics discursively relate to each other on the pages of newspapers. And that is the kind of research where you can really do quite new things, especially if you can do that in a more longitudinal way. Mapping technologies, GIS, but now also deep mapping, can really enable you to visualize, geographically visualize research in a new way that can help you to gain new insights. Network analysis is, of course, crucial if you want to look at this migration of of people, but also of books, of IDs, how this was sort of all globally circulating. Michelle is involved with the wonderful Footprints project, where this is done to sort of chart the migration of books over time. But you can also think about the Republic of Letters in a Jewish context, where you basically want to look at how intellectual IDs discourses were sort of moving through networks of scholars in a global context. So there are many.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the if I may, one of the things that we've found, this goes with something else that you mentioned about archives and access to archives in looking at inscriptions in books for Footprints, is that we're actually finding what one might think of as archival material, in that it's about information about people that just happens to be written down on the inner boards or on a flyleaf, about births and deaths and marriages and plague and all sorts of other information where we're surfacing, because we went to collect this data from books. We're surfacing almost another archive in that way. So there are so many different angles one can take, and you don't always know what you'll end up coming up with. And then your questions can change. Your results definitely will change. But it's very fluid, I would say, in looking at materials through a digital lens and bringing, I mean, in our case, it's an aggregation. We wouldn't have been able to bring together the amount of data that we did if we didn't have a digital platform. I guess we could, it would have taken a whole lot longer. But the very act of pulling this data together means that we're surfacing literally new information that had not been known before.
Yeah. If I can give an example from my own research, I've worked a couple of years in the context of an Anne Frank edition project, where we were creating a new critical edition, an annotated edition of the diaries. And of course, one big question related to the Anne Frank diaries is, why did this particular diary become such a worldwide phenomenon, and how does that play out in terms of reception in very different national contexts? And if you want to look at that, then of course part of that work starts simply with looking at, okay, how many editions have been published over the years, in what languages, etc., etc. And WorldCat metadata can, for instance, be very, very nice to start reconstructing that bigger quantitative picture before you move to the more qualitative questions of how that reception look like, which can then be answered with newspaper databases, for instance, like the Historical Jewish Press and others, to start charting how, in particular, more particular national and local contexts, that reception played out. So that's just one tiny example of how some things can now only be tackled by digital means. I've worked on a small, a little bit of a fringe topic perhaps, but some people might know that I wrote a book about Jewish volunteers who fought in the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. And a key part of that book focused around the Jewish Naftali Botwin Company, which was a Jewish military unit that was created within the international brigades in 1937. And then a little bit later, I wrote a small article about the name giver of that Jewish military unit, Naftali Botwin, who was a Polish Jewish communist executed in 1925 in Poland because he had killed a police infiltrator in the ranks of the Polish Communist Party. Now, the only reason that I could write that article and do that research is because the National Library of Lithuania has a bunch of Yiddish newspapers online from the 1920s, which contain the trial reports of Naftali Botwin's trial in 1925 in Lviv. Then, so the resonance of that trial in Yiddish circles, in the Yiddish press, I could very nicely figure out by looking at the Yiddish press. Then the Gallica database of the National French Library allowed me to access the L'Humanité, the main newspaper of the French Communist Party, which allowed me to get let's say, a non-Jewish communist perspective on that same trial. And other databases allowed me to, for example, compact memory, to reconstruct how actually the German Jewish press was looking at that trial at that time. So basically, the whole article is based on various Jewish newspapers, which sort of allowed me to create a sort of composite and comparative picture, which is still very, very limited and biased in certain ways, but which I could never have done without the availability of those digitized materials. That's definitely one thing that is for sure. I'm meanwhile looking at the chat, and I see that there is a very different topic coming up.
Yeah, I could you maybe talk about to Genevieve forgive me, question about digital literacy. I think that's really important and something I certainly encounter often. How can we train the next generations of students and researchers when many of us senior professors are not always well equipped to do so? And this is something I think that exists in many, many instances. And I've certainly experienced it quite a bit.
I think one thing is it would be really great if in some cases digital resources, digital archives and libraries provide a little bit more information about dealing with the resource. That goes actually down to the basic level of simply having an about page that outlines why you have certain materials there, how they were selected, why they were selected, what criteria were involved there. Again, that bigger discussion of the politics of digitization. There are a number of online resources that can help people to become more digitally literate, and especially an important resource there for historians is a website called the Programming Historian, which offers all kinds of lessons on different levels, from basic to quite advanced, to help you with anything from search techniques online to much more advanced issues of topic modeling and things like that. The Programming Historian is not the only teaching resource. There are others out there as well that can help. But I have to admit that there is certainly for, as you say, the more senior professors, there's a little bit of there's a lot of self-teaching resources, but that also takes the initiative to start diving into those yourself. But at individual universities, that is really a sort of gap in training that is present, I think, at many universities. We are now.
I would also encourage reaching out to the libraries.
Yeah,
many universities, libraries have taken this sort of banner of doing teaching in this area of digital scholarship. I know we have a digital scholarship department within the libraries, and that's where a lot of that teaching is happening. If it's not happening formally, like at your institute, which is all about digital scholarship, for those institutions that don't have that kind of directed training, there are often resources in the library. And there's definitely a track within librarianship for digital scholarship and teaching that way.
Yeah. And I should add actually to this discussion, the situation is difficult maybe sometimes for older researchers, but it's still a big challenge actually in educating the current generation of students as well. It's very, very locally determined the extent to which digital skills are part of the teaching curriculum. And if I look at my own field, history, I teach a basic research skills class, a seminar in our bachelor studies. And for that, I use the most recent handbooks for historical research in German, in Dutch, and also a Belgian handbook. And all three handbooks talk digital, but the amount of attention that they pay to it, for my taste, is actually way too limited. There's still quite a focus on the more traditional aspects, but how the digital archive in some ways fundamentally changes historical research, what new skills come into play, for instance, basics of searching online. I've had situations where I gave students assignments to find literature on a certain topic, and after 5 minutes, there is a finger with the student telling me, like, yeah, I can't find it on Google. haven't even looked at Google Scholar or JSTOR or WorldCat or other databases, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of work to do in simply upgrading basic skills for historians to the digital realm for the new generation of students as well. So
yeah, and a lot of that I'm seeing Sarah Crampsey's question about what programs are most relevant for students interested in graduate work in digital skills and library science. A lot of this was sort of standard training in your intro to the libraries course. You were taught how to do a Boolean search in your catalog so you can use and or if. You knew to use quotes to limit your searching. And some of the newer library catalogs start with the premise of everybody needs to Google, so we're not having any of these advanced search options. And there was a huge outcry from the librarian community because the skills go far beyond just searching the library catalog. It's now everything is a version of a catalog in order to search it. And so understanding how to do basic searching is so critical.
Yeah, and people
yes,
become so used to that one single search box that you have and just using a couple of keywords. There's a wonderful small piece of research that has been done by colleagues from, I think it's called the Malach Center in the Czech Republic, who have the local version of the Visual History Archive. And they've done work on how they have different ways of searching the archive and also other databases. And they've done very, very nice work on trying to figure out how do users actually start searching and what are the conclusions that we should draw for them from that in an age where everyone is starting to get used to just simple keyword search. And there's a lot of work to be done there as well to integrate that in skills programs. What programs are most relevant for students interested in graduate work? I think what you said, Michelle, about going to the archives and see what libraries offer in terms of skills trainings is crucially important. It's very locally determined, so it's very difficult to say like what programs in general are most relevant. You really need to figure out on the local level what is happening. What you see, of course, is that there's more and more specific courses in digital humanities and digital history that are popping up at universities. So there's a lot of change going on in how the humanities curriculum in that sense is constituted. But it's also very, very different in different countries and even in different cities. At my university in Luxembourg, because we have our center there is now, we try to do a lot in developing programs there. In the city where I live, Berlin, there is now a new digital history professor, and there's a more very active scene as well developing around teaching digital history and digital history skills. But I know places where much more work needs to be done. So it's very difficult to say that in a general sense, I would say. Yeah.
I can speak for the Association of Jewish Libraries if you're interested in learning specifically within a Jewish context. We are actively working now on a program for training specifically librarians within the Jewish studies context. And a part of that is digital skills, because that's a piece of it. It's not live yet, but we are actively putting together a program like this. And the Association of Jewish Libraries is an international organization. It's a global organization. So if somebody's interested specifically in library science skills for Jewish studies, I'd be thrilled to discuss further on that context, no matter where you are.
Which might actually be a very, very nice addition to the upcoming website as well, to think about offering information about skills trainings that are relevant for Jewish studies scholars, because there is definitely a gap there. That is for sure.
Yeah, and it's started to be filled in different ways, but I mean, a lot of the digital skills all come back to sort of cataloging, and what is metadata, but a form of cataloging. So if you're working in a digital context, doing metadata, you might want to have some of that background of sort of standards and all of that, which is very much our bread and butter in the library world. I'm gonna throw a question at you, Arben, which is asked of me all the time. So it's sort of a trick question, but I think you'll have the answer, which is, well, why isn't everything digitized? Everything should be available online. It's so easy. How come it's not online?
Money.
So,
Money.
yeah, it's money.
It's and it's not just about the money to digitize. It's actually a couple of years ago, a Dutch archival scholar, Charles Jurgens, wrote a nice article about, in which he also alluded to another dilemma in the context of digitization, which is basically that the moment archives or libraries start digitizing, they suddenly have to finance a double infrastructure, unless they're going to throw away their books and their original archives, which hopefully they don't. Then basically they suddenly are responsible for maintaining a double infrastructure, an analog one, if you will, and a digital one. In addition to having the money to digitize. And I mean, if you look at that in a global scale, the picture is very, very, very different. I mean, you can say, but that's maybe almost a little bit too crude. Sometimes people distinguish the global north and the global south, but that's actually a little bit too binary. Because even within the global south and within the global north, if it comes to the state of digitization, the differences are quite huge. Roughly saying, it's probably true that in Western Europe and North America, most digitization has been done. What you see in Europe, especially in the European Union area, is that digital has become part of the strategy of the European Commission. So digital and digitized heritage is also regarded as an economic asset and something that can be used in tourism, for all kinds of educational purpose, that can be used to generate startups that do new and exciting things. And so because of the fact that digital is so much and digitized heritage is so much on the agenda in the EU area, that means we have, in certain ways, almost an embarrassment of riches. There's really been a lot going on and a lot digitized, but even there's truckloads that hasn't been digitized. But the picture, of course, looks very different the moment you move out of Europe and you move out of North America. And then there are pockets in Asia and Latin America where there's a lot digitized, but there are also a lot of areas. For instance, in Africa, South Africa is comparatively good, but there are many countries where there's very, very little material digitized, obviously, because the resources don't exist. And that also points. And then if digitization takes place, it is very selective. So mass digitization is much less a thing. And that, of course, also means that the more selective digitization becomes, the more the battle over what should be digitized becomes important. So there is a lot of things to be said about that, but in a nutshell, it is very much about resources in the end.
Yeah. I think.
But that is also why I always emphasize the importance of cataloging. So what you see in the last 10 years is that there's sometimes this talk about hidden archives. And I understand what people mean when they talk about hidden archives, but they're only hidden because they're not online. And the problem is a little bit that talking about hidden archives sort of semantically assigns analog archives to a sort of obscure status. And yes, they are much more difficult to access because you need to go there. But for that reason, calling them hidden is perhaps a little bit too much. But it makes the importance of it makes cataloging all the more important. There's a lot of archives that might not be digitally available, but where not even a catalog or an inventory is available online. And if we don't have that, at least for the purposes of historical research, if we can't even find out what material exists online, then the whole question of what is digitized that's already on another level. But first we need to know what is actually out there.
Yeah.
So cataloging, to my mind, is really also crucially important. Again, that's why Jerusha, why the ERIC project are so incredibly important, because they do that. And they do allow you to get this more transnational picture.
Yeah, and they point to those collections that people may not have known existed, that have critical information and materials there. I mean, I'm just thinking sort of sardonically about the found in the dusty archives, when there was a perfectly acceptable finding aid that said that item was in the collection, and the researcher finally actually read the finding aid, and so they knew that material was there, but it had been cataloged. It's just a question of how to identify what's there and what can be found. And it's really complicated. Another piece also is, once it's digital, I'm thinking of all those flash sites with digitized materials that are gone. So the changes in technologies, like I mentioned in my introduction, I mean, what we had about the LCAJ, we had all this data and it existed already in a digital format. And in order to access it in the 21st century, we needed to digitize images and then OCR them again, even though they had already been input into a computer in the 60s, because of the changes in technology. And that's again goes back to this question of cost and maintenance, because servers die and need to be replaced, and technology changes and needs to be updated. And there's so much of the back end work which just adds up to a tremendous amount of cost.
Yeah, and if I may add something, so we are now in the process of creating the DHGUE website. We have this wonderful list of projects. Some of those projects that are older, we found out are already offline again.
Yeah.
So we've been looking at the Wayback Machine of the Internet Archive to actually see if we could reference an old version, and then we are contacting project owners or old project owners to ask, would you give us permission? Because some people actually don't want any reference to the old resource anymore. Some people don't mind at all. But we are dealing with projects that are sometimes not even 20 years old, that were actually quite wonderful. And they're not there anymore in the digital realm, and that's an issue.
We'll turn to another question here. Has the pandemic proven that with the online sources, we are able to teach remotely without any loss on that level?
We can do a lot, but I think for historians in training, nothing beats a visit to the archive as well, or the library. So there is definitely a big loss. And you can partly remedy that by teaching, of course. I mean, in a way, it provides a wonderful opportunity to teach us what is different in the digital realm. But you can only really properly teach that difference if you also introduce students to the analog realm. So there is a loss. There is definitely a loss, even if a lot is possible these days.
I co-taught a course on the history of the Jewish book during the pandemic with Professor Elisabeth Karlbach, and that was a digital course on the material text, which was an interesting, lots of creativity in how to teach that course, but there is absolutely no comparison to showing students the books themselves. When you bring students into the room and you open an incunable, and they can see how the book was formed. I mean, it's all about the materiality. And so in that case in particular, but I think in many cases, exposing historians in training, as you call them, to the physical material is so critical when you can do it. And I know there were book history courses where the professors put together a packet that they shipped to their students so that they would have some of these examples that they could hold during their Zoom classes.
Nice, very nice. Yeah.
I think we're quieting down in the chat. Maybe we'll give it another minute to see if there are any other closing questions. We do have a few more minutes. Maybe I'll ask you, what are you most excited about in the digital turn? What do you think as far as potentials, as far as where we can go with all of this digital materials?
So
You alluded to some of it.
one project that I find very exciting at the moment is definitely YIVO's Vilna Collections project. I can't wait to see that near completion and then really see what is possible in terms of research there, especially combining it then with other resources. Newspapers are of course quite important, but that to me is a very exciting thing. The other big development that is very important is handwritten text recognition that I already pointed to. I think that is something, of course, that's not just for Jewish studies, but that has a potential. Also, I know colleagues from early modern studies where this is going to change everything. If they can access suddenly the material, disclose the material in huge digital archives pertaining to that period, and that's really going to be a sea change. That's coming up, and I don't think people are maybe only beginning to realize what's going to happen there, but that is as important. And so one of the things that I found incredibly exciting in the realm of Yiddish studies is the search engine of the digital Yiddish library. Suddenly you can full text search 12,000 Yiddish books. And to give one example, I in that small article about Naftali Botwin that I wrote a little bit about the resonance in the Yiddish press, but also Yiddish books. And there were several plays that were published about him and things like that. And I sort of pieced together that picture from all kinds of sources. Then after the article was published, I think within a couple of weeks after the article was published, I realized that the beta search engine of the digital Yiddish library was online. So of course I went there to see like, what can I find about Naftali Botwin? And I got a much bigger picture of what that resonance actually was, because of course there are always books where you know that you should be looking, etc. But there's so much out there where you don't know. You might want to look, or where it's just one tiny nugget, but that tiny nugget then opens up a whole new world and a whole new perspective. So things like that are so important. Basically, again, that point of disclosing the information that's contained within those digital resources is really important.
Yeah, it's something that we're actually thinking about with we have all these corpora of digitized printed books. And if machine analysis can recognize the difference between print and handwriting in a printed book, then we can immediately identify that there's an annotation or there's an inscription. And that is huge. That's huge for the work we're doing with footprints. I want to give a shout out to a panel that's also dealing with digital tools that Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblett referred to, Yossi Chayes's panel on Ilanot, which is going to be at this conference. It's on Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. in Stage A, and that's actually going to be directly referring to digital tools applied to analysis and study and research. So that's if you're interested in this topic, that's another area to go to hear more about these really interesting and wonderful things that are happening within this world of digital Jewish studies. With that, I think we're going to close. It looks like we're pretty much, we have a couple of more minutes for questions, but it's quieted down a bit. This has been really wonderful, really interesting. And I just want to thank Arben Zaagsma for this really incredible talk about the digital world and digital studies in Jewish histories, Jewish studies more broadly. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much as well. And also everyone for your questions, and looking very much forward to seeing other panels as well. Thank you.